please remember your questions. We'll have a question session after the next paper. Had the privilege of meeting Anna in New York on the fringes of the Chiron meeting about 3 weeks ago. Little did I know that I'd be chairing her session here. But that's how tight an operation this is.
Thank you.
Yes, that's the best microphone there.
Let me just tell you this will. Oh, it's not coming up on
It disappears on you.
Do we have to do the present?
Yeah, you need to put that.
Okay, great.
I think it's going to work.
Wonderful. All right, hello everyone. So I will dive right in. This paper began prompted by a cognitive neuroscientific metaphor that the sculptor Ángel Ferrand made in 1953 when he published an essay called El Campo Plástico de los Párvulos. I don't even know how best to translate this, but thinking about this sort of the pliable, the plastic, the changeable ways that children's minds, how they work. He begins with this metaphor, this idea of the electronic brain, and coming from Shanghai, academically I enjoy that because that's actually the Chinese word for computer. But he uses this idea of contrasting analytical methods and these experiments to obtain geniuses with what actually we can concretely do already at that time. He says to touch the most tender brains with the electrode of the most natural experiences. So as a sculptor, as an artist, that's what he wants to use to do this work. So not to think about the weight of knowledge in the head, but how one makes use of that knowledge. So this kind of spark, this use, is what I'm interested in here, in how Ferrand, in his work as well, with another figure, Josefina Aldecoa, then known, we'll see her in the publications as Rodriguez Alvarez, her maiden name or non-pin name. So she's actually quite a famous Spanish writer, or was, but was trained as a psychologist and pedagogue, and I'll speak more to that. So I'm interested in how these terms that Ferrand is using work towards emphasizing a transnational, transgenerational legacy of progressive education. Their work transpired across their two generations. Ferrand, a reformer who actually sculpted an image that was considered an icon of pedagogical modernism in the 1920s that I'll show later, and Aldecoa, who published a book called Niños de la Guerra, Children of the War, and she herself was of this generation, born before the Spanish Civil War, 10 years old when it broke out, and the child of Republican school teachers. So by looking at their use of children's art as a form of active learning, I'm interested in how teaching and psychology were consciously passed down and revived by like-minded reformers within a larger system of restrictions. So working with this art and these visual materials matters because it crosses the boundaries between the socio-political and the psychotechnic. During the Spanish Civil War, so prior, of course, to this article, 1936 to 1939, children's drawings became a central means of propaganda. These drawings gave an urgent first-hand view of the emotional and cognitive synthesis that Picasso conveyed in his iconic anti-war painting Guernica of 1937, which was discussed in psychological terms by Rudolf Arnheim, the Gestaltist, in 1962. What Picasso did on the canvas, Arnheim claimed, echoed the mental processes of children. In sketches that stripped situations down to their structural and spatial essentials. Just as children's drawings were exhibited during wartime as a rebuke of fascist violence, so too did post-war psychologists in the victorious Francoist dictatorship use children's drawings to demonstrate and clinicalize the violence committed by a vanquished left, as scholars including Gomez Rodriguez and Mühlberger have shown. Having celebrated children's drawings before the Spanish Civil War as, again, as I said, a sort of icon of modernism, of the avant-garde, sculptors like Ferrand and others in his circle turned to these, turned in the post-war, after the Spanish Civil War, to looking at them, I argue, as adapting them to a form of, not of propaganda, but of trying to understand the creative impulse in the child. And in this way, these drawings are really unique cultural sources that allow one to look at how they're navigating the restrictions of the time. Adopting the language of science and psychology within national Catholic education. So in the post-war, the early years after World War II internationally, children's art became this unifying, universal symbol. Ferrand himself was collecting images from Japan, from Argentina, from many places. UNESCO published a special issue on children's art in 1951, and Madrid actually hosted an international exhibition of children's art in 1953, which was chronicled on Spanish national media, the so-called nodos, showing the children looking at the art of others, children from around the world, and putting particular emphasis on the work of the Spanish children in the exhibit. So such efforts kept the child at their center, quietly advancing core developmental principles of progressive pedagogy, while also, of course, having other ends. So I'm interested in texts such as this one, which was published in 1948 by Ferrand, edited with large input by Ferrand, and others that were part of the so-called Escuela de Altamira, the School of Altamira, avant-garde artists in the 1940s. And in this work, Ferrand brought together various children's drawings, which I'll look at in the following, in order to examine what exactly makes them artists, and what inspiration that has on the art of the day. So he does this through co-editing this volume, but also through hands-on practical collaborations in Madrid with, as I mentioned, Josefina Aldecoa, or Rodriguez. So in 1953, she edits a special issue of the journal Bordón, the Revista de la Sociedad Española de Pedagogía, on the question of art education and pedagogy. And she brings Ferrand in to contribute the piece that we saw here earlier, as well as her own contributions. And her piece, Sugerir o Enseñar, is going into thinking about in what ways the legacy of psychology in education, what it brings to the work of educators in that day. So she had been trained in Madrid, had gone abroad to London for the first time in 1949, where she discovered the work of the international literature on children's art. She was introduced to the work of Viennese art pedagogue Franz Zizek, and then came back with armfuls of books and began her doctoral studies at the Instituto de Pedagogía San José de Calasanz in Madrid with Garcia Hos, where she found, quote, nothing on the topic, only a few books on children's drawings and manual work with a didactic aim, subordinate to other pedagogical goals, perfection, exactitude, mastery, all very straight-laced. And we can see some counterexamples of what Aldecoa might have experienced in the voices, for instance, of Garcia Hos, under whom she was working, who in 1935, before the Spanish Civil War, says that because children are not yet able to form an adequate response to these big questions of life, it's the job of the teacher to guide them, to impose the religious and moral content that will liberate them from the servitude of his primitivism. So that's one perspective. Another comes in 1941, and these would have been the prevailing voices and textbooks that Aldecoa returned or was trained under within pedagogy. So here we have another Josefina Alvarez, or Alvarez de Cánovas, a different psychologist, who uses the language of creativity, creative imagination, the child's power of invention, spontaneous drawing, but uses it with a clear goal, which is to reinforce religious and patriotic narratives through these prompts. A walk in your neighborhood, that's maybe a little more open, but the salutation you make to your flag, that is another, will elicit a different output.
The PowerPoint hasn't changed, just
Oh.
to you to know.
Strange. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, we weren't sure if that was still the same.
Close the PDF.
Yes.
Is PowerPoint, okay, I'll close the PowerPoint.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, you open it again.
Strange, this happened a few times in
Yeah.
presentations. Oh. No, not
Is there any
changing.
other thing that's open?
I don't think so.
Well, Anna is able to give the talk without PowerPoint.
We did
know
it once
that.
before with technical
We
difficulties.
know that, we had that.
No, you need these images now.
But it's not the idea,
This
no.
one, yeah.
What else it is using this?
That's strange. Okay.
Okay, great. Very good.
Okay, not sure what we missed, but this
Go
is
on.
Creaciones 1948, so here, Garcia Hos, Alvarez de Canovas, and the prompt. Okay. So in contrast to these other models, Aldecoa returns and says, Ferrand is the only person who's doing work that in the model that I see internationally that I want to work to. Okay. She says, in Spain, as I discovered upon my return, only the great sculptor Angel Ferrand had arrived at similar discoveries. He gave me drawings from his collection of international children's art and wrote to me, children of every country are like drops of water. They're transparent, but in this transparency hides a multitude of meanings. Ferrand was right, she went on. The cries of children, their pain, are reflected in their drawings, haunting, heartbreaking drawings. So by invoking Ferrand, Aldecoa suggests a line of descent for reading the production of children's art under conflict. Such work moved from projecting an idealistic collective view of the political value of children's art, to mold and shape the child's self-understanding, and through that act, work towards a larger change in circumstances, in the school and in society at large. So this is work that she will do in founding a school of her own in the 1950s called De Colegio Estilo, right down the street from Ferrand's studio. And this is work that Ferrand himself had done in the 1930s in Madrid in starting a club for children in which they would use objects, use the work of creating, reworking objects to not imitate as the monkeys do, but to be original, to be creative, to do their own, to make works that represented them. And he connected this very consciously as well to psychological terms and principles, from intuition to consciousness and spirit, and all of this working into the school. This was the so-called Plan Ferrand that he published in 1934, I believe, encouraging the Spanish government as a whole to use art education as a way to reshape society. So if we look at the drawings that Ferrand collected and published in Creaciones, these came from the Escuela del Mar in Barcelona, which was founded before the Spanish Civil War, restarted afterwards under the new name, Antigua Escuela del Mar, with the angel now, and the Franco stamp, of course. And these images were sent to him by the school director over the years. So these are some of the images that presumably Aldecoa would have had access to. And we get glimpses of the mundane post-war, everyday life. This is the Paseo de Gracia in Barcelona. Others, a bullfight. The classroom, as Claude Amont says, diluted by the external world. At the same time, you get images that speak to almost a kind of witness or critique. Rosario Formes, a child of, don't have the age here, 1948, her Savage Dance and Massacre on the left, or Ramon Roca's Unsettling, Untitled on the right, a rack with 3 hanging figures and a 4th figure walking away with what appears to be an axe. So there's no other context for these images. They're simply given and left in the archive and others exhibit that those religious prompts that we saw, for instance, in Alvarez de Cánovas, Isabel Yort's nailing of Jesus to the cross. It was a 7-year-old girl. This was published in Creaciones, the book, or The Demon by Dolores Ibarras, which was actually published in May of 1936, before the Spanish Civil War, on the cover of the Escola del Mar's school journal. But interestingly, Ferrand must have kept it in mind, realized it kind of represented something of the time, and then republished it 12 years later. So together, Aldecoa's and Ferrand's writings suggest why children's art exhibited such an ambivalent place in early education in the Franco period. It was upheld as an imaginative good by educators across the political spectrum, yet also contained the roots of something more radical, something less contained. And for this, I turn to, again, their own writings on this. Aldecoa rejects authoritarian technical instruction in this work earlier to suggest or to teach, while Ferrand writes in the same issue that there's no wrong approach to using art in education except for that which corrects the child or deceives them, which uses lies or falsehoods to lead them somewhere, that every truth that they arrive at should be led by themselves, and if they discover disappointment, it's because they have found it in their own way. So this statement poses drawing as a kind of pliable, indeed a plastic form of truth-making within a complex world. Independent thought and action support the child's developing mind and character, which has no set mold to aspire to. Similarly, Aldecoa's school, the Colegio Estilo, which educated a lot of children of artists, writers, and other intellectuals in Madrid at the time, gave them space to let them have their independence to ask thoughtful questions while conforming officially to the dictates of the national curriculum. And Aldecoa herself speaks to this idea that the individual, as the possessor of a unique personality, must be educated in a way that is unique and differentiated, giving him all opportunities to develop completely, to find his deepest self through any means. This absence of mold, so that you can have this plastic, this pliable quality, the disdain for mechanization in teaching, equilibrium between intellectualism and the abuse of sensorial education. And that's that abuse, I argue, that we see in figures like Josefina Alvarez de Cánovas with the prompts on religious education. So I'll conclude here by arguing that recovering these pre-war artistic pedagogies in workshops and in classrooms allowed Ferrand and Aldecoa and colleagues to begin the work of normalizing a more open, reciprocal form of children's art under dictatorship, and that each of these efforts of recovery was, like Ferrand's metaphor, like drops of water, small, limited, but in their own way transparent and effective. So somehow together celebrating the imagination as a force for autonomy, countering these electric brains of knowledge, as well as the dogmatic practices of repetition and modeling that Aldecoa and others aim to counter. So I'll close there. Thanks so much.
Please stay and use this microphone.